Right now, millions of retail investors are staring at XRP sitting sideways and asking the same question out loud. Why isn't this moving? It is a reasonable question. A war broke out in the Middle East. Oil is up double digits. The fear index crashed to historic lows. Tariff announcements sent markets into brief spirals. And through all of it, XRP sat in a tight range, barely reacting, grinding sideways in a compression that tests every investor's patience in a way that neither a crash nor a rally ever does. The crash gives you adrenaline. The rally gives you validation. The sideways grind just sits there. And it tends to do something that crashing markets never actually accomplish. It makes holders quietly give up. Not in panic, in exhaustion. But here is what most of those holders are missing, because most of them are looking at the one-day price chart and asking why it is not moving. The thing that is moving right now is not the price. It is the architecture. And this week, 3 specific architectural developments happened that institutions have already decoded and retail has almost entirely scrolled past. The Genius Act stablecoin framework is creating a mandatory demand structure for a bridge asset at a scale the market has not priced. BlackRock's CFO confirmed that $5.5 trillion in assets will move onto public blockchain infrastructure within 3 to 12 months. And Hidden Road, acquired by Ripple, connected directly to the DTCC's NSCC directory this week, linking the XRP ledger to the infrastructure that clears and settles virtually every stock trade in the United States. 3 signals, 1 week, 0 movement in the price to reflect any of them. Welcome back. I'm the Calm Analyst. Today, we decode what is actually happening beneath the sideways chart, so that when the structure becomes visible to the mainstream, you are not reading about it after the fact. Let's go. Let's start with the Genius Act, because this is the development that most coverage treats as a stablecoin story and completely misses the XRP implication. The Genius Act was signed into law, establishing the first federal framework for U.S. dollar-backed stablecoins. At the surface level, most analysts read that as a regulatory story about USDC and USDT. But the structural implication runs far deeper than the assets that already exist. The Genius Act mandates 100% liquid reserves for every stablecoin issuer. And that mandate, combined with the regulatory clarity it provides, creates the conditions for an explosion of bank-issued stablecoins. JP Morgan stablecoin, Bank of America's stablecoin, national banks from Japan, the European Union, the UAE, each issuing their own regulated digital dollar equivalents, fully compliant, fully backed, operating within the Genius Act framework. This is where the bridge asset demand becomes structural rather than optional. Because here is the problem that nobody in the mainstream stablecoin coverage is asking. JP Morgan stablecoin cannot move directly into a European bank's stablecoin. They will not trust each other's token. No bank accepts a direct competitor's coin as settlement without counterparty risk. No government settles cross-border in another country's digitized currency without introducing monetary sovereignty concerns that their legal teams will not approve. Every bank-issued stablecoin is an island, compliant within its own jurisdiction, backed by its own reserves, trusted by its own clients, and completely unable to settle directly with every other island in the network. The system needs a bridge, not a bridge owned by JP Morgan, not a bridge owned by the European Central Bank, not a bridge that introduces one party's monetary policy into another party's settlement. A neutral, jurisdiction-independent, instantaneous bridge that every island can connect to without accepting any other island's sovereignty. That is the exact architectural role XRP was designed to fill from the beginning. And the Genius Act, by mandating reserve compliance and creating the conditions for hundreds of competing bank-issued stablecoins, has transformed that role from theoretical future utility to mandatory present infrastructure. The world built the problem. Ripple spent a decade building the solution. November 2026 is the full implementation deadline for Genius Act compliance. Every stablecoin issuer in the United States must be operating within that framework by that date. That is when the bridge asset demand does not just grow. It becomes required infrastructure at a regulatory level. Now let's run the math that most retail investors are not doing. Because the supply-demand arithmetic of what the Genius Act creates is the part of this story that makes the current price look structurally unsustainable in one direction. $27 trillion sits frozen in Nostro and Vostro accounts globally. Pre-funded capital sitting idle in foreign correspondent banking accounts, earning nothing, existing purely to guarantee that settlement can occur when a cross-border transaction needs to move between two currencies. That is $27 trillion of dead capital. The cost of a settlement system that requires bilateral pre-funding because it has no neutral bridge asset efficient enough to replace it. The global cross-border payment market processes $150 trillion annually. The foreign exchange market moves $7.5 trillion every single day. The derivatives market above all of this represents over $100 trillion in notional exposure that requires settlement infrastructure at the foundation. Now set XRP's supply against those numbers. 100 billion XRP total, fixed, permanent, non-negotiable. Approximately 57 billion in active circulation. The rest locked in Ripple's escrow, releasing monthly and overwhelmingly relocked. Here is the arithmetic the crowd is not running. If even a fraction of the 27 trillion in Nostro Vostro capital migrates from idle bilateral pre-funding to on-demand ODL settlement through XRP, even 1%, which represents $270 billion, the demand-to-supply ratio at current prices creates a slippage problem. There is not enough liquid XRP at current prices to absorb institutional-scale transaction flow without significant price adjustment. And this is not a prediction. It is a mathematical property of the bridge currency model. Higher price means fewer tokens needed per transaction. Higher price means less slippage per settlement. Higher price is not just beneficial for holders, it is a functional requirement for the system to operate at institutional scale. The math runs in only one direction. The system does not work at current prices when trillions are flowing through it. The Genius Act doesn't just validate the use case. It creates a compliance deadline that transforms the demand from optional adoption to mandatory deployment. Now let's talk about what BlackRock's CFO said this week, because this is the statement that should be reverberating through every institutional allocation conversation on Earth, and it barely registered in most crypto coverage. Martin Small, Chief Financial Officer of BlackRock, the largest asset management firm in the world with approximately $10 trillion under management, confirmed publicly that BlackRock plans to tokenize its entire ETF complex on public blockchains within the next 3 to 12 months. All 1,700 funds, approximately $5.5 trillion in assets. He did not describe this as a project under consideration. He described it as already in motion. $5.5 trillion, moving on to public blockchain infrastructure within 12 months. Now connect that statement to the week's other major development. Hidden Road, acquired by Ripple, just connected to the DTCC's NSCC directory. The DTCC clears and settles virtually every stock trade in the United States. Hidden Road's connection to the NSCC directory means the XRP ledger now has a direct technical link to that clearing infrastructure. BlackRock is moving $5.5 trillion in tokenized assets onto public blockchains. The XRP ledger is now connected to the system that clears every U.S. stock trade. Hidden Road sits at the intersection of institutional prime brokerage and blockchain settlement infrastructure. These three facts are not independent. They are the components of a single system coming together. The asset manager with $5.5 trillion in assets preparing for on-chain migration. The clearing infrastructure connecting to the settlement layer those assets will move through. The prime brokerage layer linking institutional capital to on-chain execution. The pipe has been soldered to the wall. That is not a metaphor. That is a technical description of what Hidden Road's DTCC connection represents. The water is not flowing yet, but the pipes are complete. And when the pressure, regulatory clarity plus Genius Act compliance deadlines plus BlackRock's tokenization window arrives simultaneously, everything moves through those pipes. Now let's look at the specific institutional behavior signals that confirm this reading is not a retail thesis. It is what the largest financial participants are already acting on. Bitcoin ETFs just experienced one of their largest single-week outflow events in recent months. Fidelity withdrew over $150 million from its Bitcoin ETF product in a single week. BlackRock saw over $140 million in Bitcoin ETF outflows in the same period. At the same time, XRP ETF products are absorbing inflows. While institutional capital is reducing Bitcoin ETF exposure, it is actively repositioning into XRP products. That is not retail FOMO. That is calculated reallocation by funds and custodians who understand something about XRP's forward utility that the average investor has not yet priced. Brad Garlinghouse specifically described this dynamic as pent-up demand, and he pointed to something that almost nobody in the mainstream coverage picked up on. XRP ETFs are now being used as lending collateral by institutions, not just as investment products, as collateral. That is a qualitatively different kind of institutional engagement. When an asset becomes acceptable collateral in institutional lending structures, it has been embedded into the financial system at a layer that is far more durable than speculative allocation. Collateral requirements do not get unwound on a bad price day. They represent structural, persistent demand from the financial infrastructure itself. Ask yourself this question directly. Do you believe BlackRock, Fidelity, and the DTCC are all moving in the same direction simultaneously by coincidence? Or are they positioned for a convergence that the retail market has not yet priced? Now let me build the specific forward timeline, because the convergence of catalysts on a compressed calendar is the part of this picture that makes the current price window distinct from any previous moment in XRP's history. The Clarity Act has White House backing, bipartisan House support, and the most powerful crypto lobbying coalition ever assembled in Washington behind it. Brad Garlinghouse placed the probability of passage at 90% following high-level White House meetings between crypto executives, banking representatives, and lawmakers. The bill defines which digital assets fall under SEC oversight and which fall under the CFTC. When it passes, the legal ambiguity that has kept institutional compliance teams from authorizing large-scale deployment dissolves. The capital that has been building in legal and compliance preparation activates simultaneously. The Genius Act's November 2026 compliance deadline means that within months, every stablecoin issuer in the United States must be fully operating within the federal framework. Every bank-issued stablecoin that comes to market under that framework adds a new island to the network that requires a neutral bridge. BlackRock's 3 to 12-month tokenization window runs through the second half of 2026. $5.5 trillion in assets preparing for on-chain migration on a timeline that overlaps directly with Clarity Act passage and Genius Act full implementation. 3 timelines. Clarity Act passage, Genius Act compliance deadline, BlackRock tokenization window. They do not run in sequence. They converge. And when catalysts converge at this density, markets do not move incrementally. They move in discontinuous jumps. The wait-and-see money becomes all-in money almost simultaneously because the competitive disadvantage of being underweight activates across every institutional portfolio at the same moment. Here is the supply compression reality that makes the timing of this window not just significant but urgent. Every time an institution moves XRP into multi-signature cold storage as working capital for an ODL corridor, that XRP does not return to the open market at a 15% profit. It is locked. It is infrastructure. It stays in the corridor performing its function for months, potentially years. Every time XRP is used as lending collateral in an institutional ETF structure, same dynamic. The token is not available for open market trading. It is embedded in a financial relationship that does not dissolve on a price movement. Exchange reserve data from CryptoQuant confirms that the freely circulating supply available on open markets has been contracting throughout the period of maximum retail frustration. The exhaustion-driven selling that the sideways grind produces has been the supply that institutional accumulation absorbs. Retail exits. Patient capital absorbs. Exchange reserves tighten. Float contracts. The supply compression and the demand catalysts approaching on the regulatory timeline are not independent variables. They are the two sides of the same equation. When the Clarity Act passes and the institutional gates open, the price does not discover against the supply that existed when retail was fully engaged. It discovers against a contracted float that has been reduced by every week of retail exhaustion since the grind began. The people who keep waiting for the right moment to enter are not waiting for lower risk. They are waiting for higher prices. That is what waiting produces when supply is being systematically compressed against approaching demand catalysts. Let me close with the single most important thing I want you to carry forward from today. Hidden Road connecting to the DTCC's NSCC directory this week was not a press release. It was not a partnership announcement. It was the moment the pipe was physically soldered to the wall of the global financial system. The XRP ledger now has a direct technical connection to the infrastructure that clears and settles virtually every stock trade in the United States. That is not a speculative thesis. That is a documented technical reality. And it happened in the same week that BlackRock's CFO confirmed $5.5 trillion moving onto public blockchains in the same regulatory environment where the Genius Act created mandatory bridge asset demand, with the Clarity Act approaching a 90% passage probability on a compressed summer timeline. The architecture has never been more complete. The institutional signals have never been more aligned. The supply float has never been tighter against approaching demand catalysts. The water is not flowing yet, but the pipes are done. And when the valve opens, when the Clarity Act removes the last compliance barrier, when the Genius Act compliance deadline makes the bridge mandatory, when BlackRock's tokenization window activates, everything moves through infrastructure that was quietly, methodically, precisely assembled while the retail crowd was asking why the price wasn't moving. Price is the lagging indicator, structure is the leading one. Comment pipes below if you made it all the way through this breakdown. I want to see who is reading the architecture, not just watching the chart. Stay patient, stay rational. The pipes are complete. The pressure is building. We don't wait for the future. We plan for it.